This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. This episode is brought to you by 18 Alpha Fitness. Achieving peak mental and physical performance requires training. 18 Alpha Fitness uses decades of special operations fitness experience to transform customers into the best possible version of themselves. Whether that's preparing for the rigors of special operations training, improving personal fitness, or confronting personal or professional life with a renewed sense of performance and focus, 18 Alpha Fitness has a plan. High-performance environments require detailed, focused, and all-inclusive workouts that challenge our body and mind while pushing us towards a goal. The key to successful completion is trust and respect between trainer and trainee. Their team of experts will monitor and develop your performance from every perspective. 18 Alpha Fitness is led by special operators who've been there. They train to win, and they train to conquer any challenge. Visit 18afitness.com for more. A senior leader once told me that something comes from being on Earth longer. I've also been told that the most important resource an entrepreneur has is energy, not time. The rapidly growing industry of hypersonic propulsion requires both sage experience and youthful vigor. The team at Velontra Hypersonics has both. I'm joined in this episode by their president, retired Major General Craig Whelden, and their founder and CEO, Rob Keane. General Whelden brings 40 years of leadership and experience in the defense industry. Rob brings engineering and innovation. Together, they're propelling objects at 5 times the speed of sound and disrupting an industry that has long been dominated by Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon. Pushing the sound barrier has not been done since the 1950s. It was an area the United States once dominated, but today, we're losing ground to China. Rob shares with me the technology needed in the next war, how he's implemented the FAST model to problem solving, and why bringing in Craig was so integral to competing. Craig provides his command philosophy, the importance of character in choosing your team, and his top leadership quirks that bring organizations and people all the wrong attention. General Whelden, Rob, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks for inviting us.
Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
On this podcast, we talk a lot about effective intelligence. And we define it as our ability to take our past experiences and apply those lessons learned to our current and our future decision making. In essence, it's the concept that our past shapes our future perspective. And that happens both good and bad. A former boss of mine, who, General Whelden, you might know him, Jim Linder, he used to tell me that something comes from being on Earth longer. And I never knew what that meant until I started working for him, and he just saw problems differently than the rest of the staff did. You've led organizations of every size. You've led them in every part of the world. You've led them at every risk level. You've then gone on to share those lessons with those of us who can use those experiences to better ourselves through your book, which I read and I thought it was amazing. I've even shared it with a bunch of folks. And you've done what you call pay it forward. Rob, no organization has greater need for effective intelligence than a startup. There's no playbook. There's no script. There's no how-to when you look at the problem set you want to tackle and you say, how am I going to do this? Especially in an industry that you're in that requires constant innovation and at a rapid pace, because if you're not constantly thinking about the next thing and you can't leverage experience, you're going to get bypassed. You're going to get moved on. You started a Hypersonic Propulsion company. I didn't even know what hypersonic propulsion was until Craig and I spoke, and I had to go look it up. So there's not a whole lot of people in this, but it's super technical, which means it's not an easy challenge to go after. But you had the vision, you saw the path. I like this conversation, and I'm excited to have you both here because we can look at entrepreneurs and we can look at leadership. We can look at building an organization from 2 different perspectives. One from a senior experienced leader who's seen it all and done it all, and then one from a young founder who has a vision, but who had the wherewithal to realize very early on that I need this senior leader to come in here and help guide this organization. So the two perspectives, I think, are something that we can talk about. So Rob, can you talk about what is the company, what was your vision for it, and what's a hypersonic propulsion system?
Okay, that's a couple questions. Let's see if I can get them and then remind me when I miss one. So maybe let's just lay a little of the groundwork. What is hypersonic? So most people are at least familiar with the idea of the speed of sound. And we call the speed of sound Mach. Mach 1 means you are traveling at the speed of sound. If you go faster than Mach 1, you're now traveling at a speed called supersonic. What's cool about this is it's very clearly defined. Like, we get it. You're faster than the speed of sound, you're supersonic. So the first thing I'll tell to all the people who don't feel like they understand what hypersonic is, don't feel bad. Neither do the scientists. There's not an incredibly clear definition for what hypersonic is. A rule of thumb we sort of use is Mach 5, or 5 times faster than the speed of sound. Here's a frame of reference. The speed of sound at sea level is about 742 miles per hour. So 5 times the speed of sound, 742 times 5, it's around 3,500 miles per hour. That's roughly what hypersonic means. There's some other fun physics people talk about. It's when the atoms begin to disassociate with each other. Anyways, nerd stuff. But generically, that starts occurring somewhere around or a little above Mach 5. So that's one. That's what hypersonic is. I'll let Craig talk a little bit about more why it matters. I'll stick, at least for now, on this question a little bit on the technical. So what are we doing in that space? Well, if you want to go that fast, it takes a lot of force, a lot of thrust. And so one is hypersonic propulsion. We can dive into what we do, but we're designing a propulsion system that uses air, like a jet engine, but can produce enough thrust to overcome the drag and get you to that speed. That's the propulsion side. We also designed the aircraft, and there's some unique fun things about the aircraft. So we're a term called vertically aligned, and that we designed both the propulsion and the aircraft. This is the same thing SpaceX does. They design the rocket and the rocket motor. And if you look at a lot of the startups in this space, I don't know how familiar you are, Venus, Hermes, etc. A lot of groups in this space are moving towards a vertically aligned structure. At those kind of speeds, you can't just design an aircraft and then go walk over to the Walmart engine shop and be like, I'll buy that one and just bolt her on and it's going to be all right. The two are so critically interfaced with each other. We think it's critical from an efficiency as well as just raw tech standpoint to control them both.
So what do you see as the applications?
So the application's going fast. So a core application, one that led us very early on, was we're currently flat out behind the Chinese and the Russians in the area of hypersonic weapons. And what hypersonics allows you to do is go very, very quickly. And you also, to some extent, because you're going so fast, you tend to get longer range. The two are kind of tied. That kind of speed, 5 times faster than the speed of sound, that is over 5 times, 6, 7 times faster than our cruise missiles. That allows a Chinese or Russian adversary to launch a weapon system. And by the time we detect a launch, identify what it is, identify where it's going, realize we need to do something about it, communicate it to, say, that ship defensive structure, that if the ship's individual defensive systems now have to lock on, they have to acquire, there has to be a handoff to that, then the actual individual responsive unit, that's the defensive rocket, missile, gun, whatever has to, it's too late. That thing is already punched through the carrier. And literally, that is the problem. Our fleet defenses, our overall U.S. strategy is very carrier-centric. I think that's fair to say. Craig understands this a little better. And that's the whole problem. They can take out our carriers, and we can't without them. And therefore, what do we have to do? We have to move our carriers further back, essentially strategically. So that's one of the core applications is A, giving us the same kind of threat, that classic deterrence, we have it, you have it. B, defending against the threat. If you want to defend something very fast, you need something very fast. And then the ability to transport rapidly. And then there's some other fun applications on low Earth orbit, space access, some good commercial stuff that we can provide more efficiently, and we're pretty excited about that.
So the core values of the company are innovative problem solving, mission accomplishment, transforming the defense of freedom, and total accountability. Why did you think, Rob, that it was important in this early phase of the company to bring someone like Craig in to begin to execute on those core values?
So the core values, I'm glad you pointed them out, and we try to actually have those matter. A lot of big name companies and small name companies have some random core values on the wall, or even military groups, some of them, and don't necessarily embody them. But we try to make them work. And when we were discussing internally bringing Craig on the team, we went through each of those core values and talked about how do we think Craig matches each one of them. There were 2 primary reasons for which we were very interested in having Craig be a permanent member of the team. And they are in this order. Number 1, the simple largest reason that we were interested in Craig was his raw leadership experience, his ability to mentor, his ability to help grow a team. We're a young team, or I guess we call ourselves middle-aged or young, something like that, but we don't have that raw experience. And after working with Craig for a short time, I quickly realized there was a reason he was a general grade officer in a senior executive service. He really understands it. You've read his book. He gets leadership. And that was something I really thought we could use with the team. We had a good team, but it felt a little bit like we're all over here. We needed somebody who could bring that in. That was the number one reason we were interested. And then the second reason was, as you mentioned, the transforming the defense of freedom. And you saw when I answered your question, I went straight there as a core starting point for us. Is defending America against adversary nations in this technology area. His understanding specifically, and he'll talk about some of his experience in the Pacific and with a threat and at the strategic level. That's experience I don't have. I was a staff sergeant. It's experience, but it's a little different. And that was another key thing, is his understanding of that threat, his experience with that threat, and his connections and understanding how the military works and how to work in that ecosystem.
So Craig, why jump in?
Why jump in with the Velontra?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me tell you how I got introduced to Velontra. I actually met Rob about 6 months ago, but my journey to Velontra really started 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, I was the Chief of Staff of U.S. Army Pacific out in Hawaii. And as a collateral duty, I was also the Chief of Staff, I was the Deputy Commander of U.S. Army Pacific. As a collateral duty, I was also the Chief of Staff of a joint task force that was, pun intended here, hyper-focused on China. So for 3 years, I focused on China in that capacity, and I understood the challenges that we had in confronting that. Now, this is 2000 to 2003. I then retired in 2003, went into the private sector for about 7 years, came back into the federal government, this time working for the Marine Corps as a senior executive service member back in Hawaii. And my charge then was to move 9,000 Marines and their family members from Okinawa to Guam, build a base in Guam, put about $1 billion worth of training ranges on a little island called Tinian in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, just north of Guam. And so I did that for 9 years before I went into the third chapter of my life. And during that 9-year period, I watched China grow exponentially, not just in their capabilities, but their technology and the quantity of weaponry that they were able to put forward. They also, in those 9 years, well, I spent 8 of those 9 years doing environmental studies for a base in Guam. They built a dozen or so islands in the middle of the South China Sea and militarized them. So they are far ahead of us in a number of areas, both quantitatively and qualitatively, particularly in hypersonics, where we have no advantage whatsoever. And as Rob just said, if you can't react fast enough because of the speed of an inbound missile, then you're probably going to get hit. So when I met Rob and I met the Velontra team, that's the first thing that struck me, was these guys are working on a gap that exists not just with China, but also with Russia, that we're going to have to close, we, the United States. And so that's the first thing that impressed me. The second thing that impressed me was the approach that they were taking. Their approach was kind of like Skunk Works 60 years ago, Lockheed Martin, when they built the SR-71 in record time, the fastest airplane on the planet. They empowered their engineers, they gave them the resources they need, and they said, we need you to put together the fastest airplane in the world. And they did that. And this company, Velontra, is taking a very similar approach. Both Rob and the Chief Technical Officer, Joel, have extensive experience in the corporate America, in the defense industry, and have watched the slow bureaucratic wheels turn. And because of the 12 years that I spent in Pacific, I understand that just moves so slow, too slow, that we're not ever going to catch up unless we take a different approach. So first, technologically, they were going after closing a gap that we clearly have, that everybody recognized. Secondly, their approach was do it faster, cheaper, and better than the competition. And even though it's a startup, I was very impressed with the approach. So I said, let me see if I can help you open some doors in the Department of Defense. And I started knocking on those doors. And after about 3 weeks of that, that's, I think, when Rob and the team did an assessment of me, and they said, hey, we'd like you to be a more permanent member of the team. And so that's when I came on full time.
You talk about rocks in your backpack. It's a big part of the book, and that throughout your life you pick up these rocks and you put them in your backpack. You use the good ones, you discard the bad ones, but from all of them you learn. So what were the rocks of knowledge that you initially thought you could bring to the organization?
Well, for your listeners, let me tell that quick story. Life is a journey. Your profession is a journey and your life is a journey. And as you go through your journey, one of the things that I have a chapter in my book about mentorship, and one of the areas that I talk about was the most valuable form of mentorship for me is what I call virtual mentorship. Well, what does that mean? That means that as you go on your journey through life, it's like walking down a path. And as you are walking down the path, and there are rocks along the path, each of those rocks represent an experience that you have or an observation that you make. And as you see those experiences, have those experiences, or see those observations, pick those up, put them in your rucksack, and carry them with you, both the good and the bad, so that years from now, you can reflect on what you experienced that was very, very good, or what you experienced that was very, very bad. And I've got lots and lots of rocks in my rucksack that I picked up over many, many decades. So that's the story, is you use the experiences of your life to shape what you might do in the future. And let me give you a simple example in my military career. I was a tanker. I was a cavalry guy. That's all I did for 20 years. I was a commander or an operations officer. My job, and most of my time was growing up during the Cold War, and so I spent about 10 years in Europe, because that's where half the armor force was fighting the Soviet Union. That's what we were preparing to do. And when I became a full colonel and I came out on the command list, the Army told me I was going to command a base. And I said, a base? Are you kidding me? I don't know anything about running a base. And quite frankly, I don't care to learn. I'm a tanker. I'm a cavalry.
Sounds terrible.
Yeah, it sounded terrible at the time. It truly did. And there was a one-star general in the division at the time named Shinseki, Eric Shinseki, who ended up being the chief of staff of the Army a few years later. But General Shinseki agreed and said, I'm going to try to get you to a tactical unit. So he tried through the chain of command to get my slating, as they call it, to command a base changed. And he failed because the four-star general in charge of Europe said, look, Whelden is in Würzburg, Germany. That's where he currently is, and he's been slated to command the base in Würzburg, Germany. He's a square peg in a square hole. He's been a customer for 18 months. It makes no sense to move him. By the way, he has credibility with the largest customer there, the 3rd Infantry Division, because he just spent the last 18 months as the operations officer for the 3rd Infantry Division. And we also need pretty good guys running bases. And so the four-star general in charge of Europe did not approve of changing the slate or even taking it back, because that would have required the Chief of Staff of the Army's approval to change it. And I became a base commander. And I learned in about 3 months, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I learned more about people, I learned more about leadership than I ever would have had I just stayed in that traditional stovepipe, combat arms lane that I had been in for the last 20 years. I switched over from 100% military, 100% male, to 95% civilians, 50% female, half of them were German. I was doing everything from running child care centers to paying the electrical bill, to building new buildings, to doing town halls, to doing labor union negotiations, things I had never done in my life and I knew very, very little about. And the 2-week course that they sent me to learn how to do that wasn't enough.
There's actually a school to learn how to run a base?
Yeah, there is. And it lasts about 2 weeks. And all of a sudden you're an expert. So I went in and I told the chain of command, look, I'm a pretty good judge of character, I believe. That has served me well over the last 20 years. And I think I know when people are telling me the truth and people are not telling the truth and BSing me and so forth. And I trust you until you demonstrate you're not worthy of that trust. And that puts kind of a healthy pressure on people. Wow, we don't want to violate his trust. And I'm here to help you in ways that you otherwise can't get, progress on with your problem. So you need to help me understand where your greatest challenges are so I can apply the resources at my level to help fix your problem, which happens to be my problem, which is the community's problem. And I did that for almost 2 years as a commander there, and it worked very well. I became the first former base commander to get promoted to brigadier general. And it's not because I was a brilliant base commander, because I, even coming out of that experience, didn't know a whole lot about running a base. But what I did know something about was being a good judge of character.
So I think about, when you tell this story, the phrase that we use of hire for character, train for skill. It's one of the core tenets here on the podcast, where we say you don't have a lot of experience in this world. I mean, you look at Velontra right now. You're not an engineer, but Rob's an engineer. I mean, certainly by the description of what the company does, it's extremely technical and takes that level of technical expertise to be able to execute this every single day. Plus, he worked at GE Aviation, he worked at BAE, but you come in and now you have to apply a similar mindset of when you were at the base. So, Rob, I have a question on this about why go with Craig over an Air Force pilot who probably had his head stuck in the back end of an airplane for the last 30 or 40 years?
Excellent question. And for this, I'm going to go back to the Force Recon background. There's a couple key things. One of the first things that we learn is it takes heart. I'm sure you had some of the same experiences in the SF community. Heart is what I'm looking for. Not actually big muscles. Not actually the fastest guy. When I recall, me in my early training days and, the super high attrition rates and people quitting or failing or not making, there were a lot of people faster than me. There were a lot of people stronger than me. There were a lot of people bigger than me. But what it came down to was the heart, because they'll get you in shape. And then I fast forward a little bit, I was on the instructor side. Right now, staff NCO, getting people ready to go to the recon school, ready to go to the combatant dive school, et cetera, and so forth. And that was something I also quickly learned. When you have a new group of people you're working with, don't judge them and look at that guy who's all ripped and he looks like he's a Greek god and assume he's going to be the best. Because quite often, he wasn't. Because he'd done quite well based on his raw strength. But when it really came down to having that grit and that cut, it wasn't always that. Now it's a full mix, as you know. There's guys who are huge and amazing and there's guys who are not. But I learned I didn't care how strong someone was because I could make them strong. Painful process, but I could make them strong. As long as they had the heart, the no quit, and the will to learn. As long as they had that drive, they still had that energy that they were there to learn. We'll get you there. So it's not the raw strength. In fact, it really doesn't even take that long if you think about it. 3 months in one of the prep courses, whether it's the Green Berets one, ours, the SEALs, whatever. 3 months of that, anybody's going to be in pretty solid shape. But will you last the 3 months? Will you work through it? So what Craig brings is, one, he does bring a couple direct skill sets. I'd like to point that out too. The issue we're trying to solve is a strategic issue ultimately, and I don't understand strategy. So he is directly bringing that to the table for sure. And then his understanding of how to interface with the military at a high level. That is another thing that he is bringing. But something else that Craig has demonstrated and I've been very impressed with is, one, he's humble. The fact he's coming and working with us on this thing, and he's a general, he's got 30 years, he's been at more high level things than I've ever been in my life. And yet he's willing to work with us and he's willing to learn. And he will ask questions, and he has progressed. And he can right now tell you a lot about hypersonics, a lot about our system. He could talk to you right now about why a ramjet's different from a rocket. I don't know this for sure. I'll let Craig back me up on this if I'm right.
We're going to put him to the test in a minute.
Sure, do it. And I'll give him a grade, unintended there. 6 months ago, I would bet if you asked Craig what's the difference between a ramjet and a rocket, I would bet he could not tell you that. I'm kind of guessing here, but I have a suspicion it's something he's learned. That's something that I've been very impressed with and immediately is like he said, one, he talked about all the rocks, those experiences, those things. What Craig has not lost is the desire to keep picking up new rocks, keep learning new things. And that gives you an incredible person to be a leader in your team. Not only does he bring all those things that I just talked about, but he's willing to keep learning and now apply them to a new field. Take all of those skills, all of those people skills, all those personal skills, all those direct knowledge of the military and all this other stuff. And now, how does this apply to running a small business? That's a new one for both Craig and I. We're both learning that one. And then also, you're right, the specific technical, this is an engineering startup field. So it's really been awesome. I'll work with a high conviction person a million times. And also in our hiring strategy, I am more interested with that smart engineer who I know is going to work and learn stuff. I can deal with that so much more. I'm considered low experience in the engineering field, even at GE, right? I show up at GE at 30, so there's a lot of people who are my colleagues who've been there for 8 or 10 years. Yet, if I could not be too arrogant, my performance absolutely matched or exceeded. How? Because I brought that same mentality of I'm going to learn, I'm going to work my ass off, and we're going to get here. So anyways, go ahead, Fran, sorry.
I was going to ask Craig what he's been learning, because you both talked about learning, but now we just have to ask him the question of what is the difference between a ramjet and a jet engine?
So I think the better question is what's the difference between a rocket and fuel injection system that we're doing? What sets us apart from everybody else? Because all of your listeners may have seen, are probably aware that SpaceX just launched a rocket with 4 civilians just a couple of days ago, 2 nights ago, I think, into space, and it's going higher than the 2 previous ones.
Well, they paid a lot of money for that.
Yeah, they absolutely did. And it costs an awful lot of money to put that rocket up into the air. When a rocket leaves the ground, it has zero stability because it starts from a standing start. So it needs a tremendous, unbelievable amount of thrust to get it off the ground, ultimately to a speed it needs to go. And it takes a while to do that. That's the reason you see it so unstable or unstable at the very beginning. And at Cape Canaveral, if the wind is blowing more than 7 or 8 miles per hour, they may cancel it because they don't want that instability to occur when the rocket is 3 feet off the ground. What's the difference between what we do and what they do? We're an airplane. We're a drone, unmanned airplane, essentially, that takes off like an airplane, that gathers speed on a runway and gets going and then climbs on its own. And so it's much, much more fuel efficient, much, much more stable than a rocket, and much less expensive than a shuttle and those 2 absolutely gigantic pods that they had on either side, which they had to discard. Those pods were to get it off the ground, to get it high enough so it can, get the momentum it needs to get into space. Our approach is much, much more efficient than that. There are an awful lot of companies that are in the rocket business. There are not a whole lot of companies that are in, the kind of approach that we're taking. So that's really a differentiator for us. To illustrate that point, Rob tells a story better than I do. A rocket is kind of like a dragster, if you want to use a metaphor, and our system is more like a Ferrari. So if you want something that goes very, very fast, very quickly in a straight line, go for a rocket. If you want something that can maneuver, that can change speeds, that has flexibility and capabilities that rockets don't have, then you go with us.
Yeah, no dragsters making that hairpin turn 1 in the Le Mans and then re-accelerating up. That's kind of the thing that you get. A Ferrari it's not quite it takes it a little bit longer to get to 200 miles an hour than, say, a dragster, but a dragster can't slam on the brakes on that first hairpin turn, do a turn, and then re-accelerate. And Craig absolutely nailed it. And a lot of what we're offering, you mentioned just stability, flexibility of mission control, whereas a rocket is, if you need a rocket, you need a rocket. But if you want much flexibility and efficiency, you're going to have to go something else. That's another thing. A dragster is highly fuel inefficient. So it burns all its fuel in a few seconds. Whereas, a Ferrari could have to do 24 hours of Le Mans kind of thing. It's concept. So very similar. It's a great analogy, Craig.
One of the value propositions that you've put forth from the company is this fast problem-solving approach. Fast, attributable, scalable, tangible is an acronym in there. Can you talk about that concept, how you've applied it in the company? And we've spoken a lot about speed, over the last few minutes. So I think it's very fitting, but how have you applied that concept into the culture of the organization?
Super critical to it, this fast approach, speed, and I'm sure if you're familiar from, again, the special operator days, speed and violence of action tending to be a key. Any decision is better than no decision. A lot of that is embodied in the company. So we're behind the Chinese and the Russians, and this has been gradually occurring, maybe not gradually, but over the last 20, 30 years, this has been shifting. As an example, the F-22, state-of-the-art airplane. It's amazing, right? The development began in the 80s. If you take from when they first drew the first lines on a napkin to when the last one rolled off the line, you're looking at a 30-year cycle, because the F-22 design began in the 80s, and the last ones didn't roll off until the 2000s or 2010s or something. So 30-year cycle. Is the F-22 amazing? Yes. Is its technology state-of-the-art? Yes. So the U.S. is capable of developing state-of-the-art technology that would surpass the Chinese. It could surpass the Russians. So why are they surpassing us? It's not because we're not smart enough. It's because we take too long and it costs too much. With the F-22 and the F-35 program, both the Obama and Trump administrations respectively had to cut those respective programs. And in my unasked for opinion, they were both right to do so. They cost so much. I think we have a total of like 170 F-22s. And as Craig was talking about, quantity becomes a quality in and of itself. So the real problem, although I couched it as technical problem, we're behind them, but you got to dive more into it. Why? Because we're taking too long. It's too expensive. Let's fast forward to the SR-71. First time a ramjet was really operationally done, something like that. From 1957, I think that's when it was funded by the CIA at the time, the first flying prototype was done in 3 years. Literally 10 times faster.
So back then they did it in 3 years. Now we've actually slowed the innovation process.
There you go. So how come, and this is kind of now let's talk about that process, that fast process, and this is something where, my CTO, this is a little bit more technical, our partner. How come with modern manufacturing techniques like 3D printing, modern computing techniques, we're slower? We should be faster. These guys were using slide rules and hand calculations and built the fastest plane ever, still holds speed records to this day. actually for some certain flight routes. So the SR-71 still holds speed records. How come now, literally 60 years later, it's going to take us decades and trillions of dollars? So that's where he said, no, we can do this fast. And obviously we're going fast. Obviously there's some shameless marketing in that little acronym. But what do I mean by that fast process? One, design quickly. So what I've seen at corporate America is they will spend 2 years to get that 99.99% computer simulation, right? They'll just forever just on the computer, resimulating. What we do is we spend 2 days to get the 80% solution. And then let's get it on test stand. Let's build something. Let's get something physical. That's the T. That's that tangible and that fast acronym. That's what we mean by tangible. We're going to get something quickly. The other thing is we talk about the attritable. That's an Air Force word they've kind of made up. Pretty sure it's a made up Air Force word, but
There's a lot of made up Air Force words, don't
aren't
worry.
there though? I mean, isn't the Air Force made up in and of itself? They just took it out of the Army. It's pretty much made up.
Now, they could be one of our customers, so it'd be
I
nice.
apologize. That was not spoken as a Velontra CEO. That was spoken as an old Marine.
As a Marine Force
That was
Recon guy.
Yeah, that was spoken as a Marine talking craft. No. The Air Force is awesome.
That's the effective intelligence coming out there and
Yeah.
saying, think before you speak there.
Yeah, that's something I gotta work on. I'll always do. See, there's some excellent mentorship by Craig. So he's always guiding, helping.
By the way, my dad was in the Air Force for 20 years, flew C-47s in China and India in World War II in support of Chennault's Flying Tiger. So I have a special place in my heart for the Air Force.
Mike was in the Army Air Corps too, actually. In fact, my mom has a propeller. Anyways, his days. So attritable. That's the affordable mass. That's the costing. So fast. I started. There's 2 reasons why we're behind. I said we're too slow. We're too expensive. So in that fast acronym, the first thing is fast. And I just told you how we're designing fast. The second is we're too expensive, and that's the attritable. We've got to design lower cost, and we do that by not trying to get the 99.999%. Just get the 80%. Use that existing stuff. Go off the shelf when you can and target those lower cost options where we can get the affordable mass. Because I don't care how good the F-22 is. I don't care if it defeats the first 10 enemy fighters. They say like 10 to 1, it'll beat them all. 20 to 1, it'll beat them all. It's okay. The Chinese will throw up 100. Literally. And then it's not going to matter. Even if you still don't shoot the F-22 down, it's out of missiles, it's over. It can sit there and not be shot down and watch as the other 80 come in. So that's the attritable thing. Scalable. This helps with the speed and this helps with the attritable. We usually start small intentionally because everything about it is cheaper. It literally uses less material. It needs less fuel. I need to ram less air in. I need to heat up less stuff. All the expense. The test stand it's sitting on can be smaller. That's cheaper and easier for it to meet. That's that scalable because then I can learn the fundamental physics, right? The hardcore tech stuff, most of it I can learn at a smaller scale and learn a lot, rapidly prototype, advance that technical readiness level, and then I scale it up. That also applies a little bit to, there's a lot of applications we can go. We can scale this down to a very, very small type application or a larger one. And then finally, tangible. We're hardware centric. I think, we started with very brilliant people working with slide rules who did amazing things with essentially zero computer power, even going to the moon. Come on, your cell phone has probably double or 10 times the computing power the Apollo rocket had.
And I need a new cell phone, too.
And you need one, you still have 10x the computing power. So we did amazing. I think we've forgotten what you can do without computers. And I'm not an anti-computer. I'm a tech guy. I'm a nerd. I've got a master's in aerospace engineering. I'm all about power. But I think we've relied too much on it. And we need to shift the other way to a better balance. Back to a little bit more hardware focused. Because you've seen some companies, let's name a company that's very successful and employed this approach. Brilliant people, all the computing power in the world. Guess what? It still fails. Something still happens. Because it's not all predictable. A model is still only a model. We have a saying. And this is an engineering thing. We say this: all models are wrong, some models are useful. And it actually has some fun life applications there too, but keep that in mind. So what we want to do is, hey, understand your model's wrong, so get the use you can out of it, but then let's learn something. Let's just see what actually happens. Get some real data back that lets us understand what's really going on. Now we can plug that in those models and get a lot better. That's our fast process.
I like this process because I think you can apply it to any organization. It really doesn't matter to the industry if you quantify your problem set with in this manner. This episode is brought to you by Analytics. Whatever industry you're in, Analytics has a group of experts with experience bringing efficiency, transparency, and analysis to your business performance. This includes franchises, restaurants, hotels and hospitality, professional services, e-commerce, startups, and retail. People and collaboration are 2 of the most important factors in running a successful company. Whether it's private label service, collaboration, or direct engagement with your customers, analytics can be involved in your client relationships, or they can complete all that other stuff and let you take the credit for it. Visit analytics.com for more information. That's ANALYTIX.com. Character is a critical part of the development of a team because it doesn't matter and how many ideas you have and how great they are. If you don't have the right people and you don't have good people who abide by a certain set of character traits to execute on that vision, you'll never get there. And you can have all the money in the world, you can have all that. It doesn't matter. So, Craig, in the book, you talk about a couple of different character traits. And you say that a critical and foundational element of the very best leaders is character, with qualities like ambition, perseverance, self-awareness, empathy, humility, integrity, and always taking seriously the responsibility of being a leader, often while sacrificing their own personal welfare or gain. On the podcast, we talk about the 9 characteristics of SOF as it relates to assessment, selection, and recruitment of SOF personnel, and then tying them into the corporate world being drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, effective intelligence, team ability, curiosity, and emotional strength. A lot of parallels to what you've laid out in your theory. This industry, as you've mentioned, your competition, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, I mean, these are the big players that have been around in those 30-year development cycles, but not only for one airplane, for multiple airplanes over, a tremendous amount of time. Can you talk more, Craig, about these characteristics as you build this team, as you look at the talent that's required to move forward and really scale this thing? What are you looking for, and what's the evaluation process that you're putting in place to make sure you're bringing in the right level of talent?
Yeah, Fran, that's a great question. I would go back to our earlier discussion about values. When I came on board, the values for this company had already been established early on. It's one of the first things they did when they sat down as a team was, what's the objective? What's the vision? What are the values of this company? And that became kind of the base plate. When I wrote my book, I had never written a book before. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I thought I was a pretty decent writer, but it was pretty intimidating to write a book when somebody said, you should write a book. But when I got done with the manuscript, I hired an editor, a guy that I met in California, and I sent it to him. And he said, tell me what you think the most important aspect of leadership is. And I said, without question, it's character, strength of character. And he said, then that should be chapter 1 in your book. And I said, okay. So as you look at my book, you'll see that chapter 1 is character, the foundation of all great leaders. There's a quotation I have in there that was one of my heroes, my personal heroes, John Wooden. He was a famous basketball coach, won more NCAA championships than just about anybody on the planet. He taught his players more than just basketball skills. He taught them how to work as a team. He also taught them an awful lot about character. And one of the quotes that I love from him is, talent is God-given, be humble. Fame is man-given, be grateful. Conceit is self-given, be careful. Let me say it again because it's kind of a tongue twister, but if you listen to the words, they're powerful. Talent is God-given, be humble. Fame is man-given, be grateful. Conceit is self-given, be careful. So character is a foundation that without which just about everything else fails. And you really see the strength of a person's character when they're under pressure. You either see it hold or you see it fall apart. And that's been my experience over 40 plus years associated with the military. And so I think I'm a pretty good judge of character, and that's the skill set, I guess, that I took going into base command. When I took command of a base in the early 90s is, look, I don't know much about running a base, and quite frankly, I don't know much about hypersonics, but I do understand something about people, and I think I'm a pretty good judge of character. And it's almost intuitive. It's not completely, but it's almost intuitive. You can either judge that or you can't judge it. And I've been more right than I've been wrong. And when I met this team, Rob and Joel and Mark, I said to myself, these guys have the strength of character that I'm looking for, and I feel pretty good. And over the past 6 months as we've worked together, I think we've gelled and we've gotten to know each other better. And so when we start bringing other people into the team, we're all measuring them by that same metric, starting with character. Because if they don't have character, it almost doesn't matter what technical skills they bring to the table.
So Rob, Seth Goldman, the chairman of Beyond Meat, he also said that an entrepreneur or a founder cannot delegate anything at the beginning. Craig said in his book, if you believe everything depends on you to ensure that it's done properly, then you're in for a rough road ahead. It can be hard to relinquish control, but leaders need to delegate. And to do that, you need to trust those below you and the people below them and the folks below them, unquote. And Craig has talked about trust, a few minutes ago, and that being a central element to building these organizations. Where are you in the life cycle of the business as you sit here as the founder? You look around, it's starting to gain traction. You're starting to talk to the right people. Things are taking off. What's that pressure like on you? Is it still very centric? Are you able to start to delegate? And how has Craig been instrumental in getting you to understand that you can relinquish some of that? And then we can go to Craig and ask him if you're actually doing that.
Yeah, I get my grade
too.
So
put him on the spot. Yeah.
That's fair. I put him on the spot. I deserve to be put on the spot the same. That's extremely fair.
This is like a counseling session for you guys.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah, you should look at another job as a therapist or something. I'm not sure, Fran. You're good at it. So you start a business, you got to do a lot of the work. You don't have people and you don't have the money to pay people. And certainly we're still in that. Now we have grown the team a little bit. We've got some board of advisors. I think sum total on the company between direct employees, advisors, I think we're at 10 or 11, if I remember from counting this up right. In that vicinity is roughly where we're at. So that does allow for some expansion of delegation. The other thing that I think I've found to be critical in an early startup, and it leans well towards, again, the special operations community, is a little bit of a jack of all trades. You're going to wear a lot of hats. You're going to have to do a lot. When Craig came on the team, the very first thing, direct feedback to the team he gave us was, Rob is doing too much and he needs help. It's his first feedback. So you hit the nail on the head. Exactly. It was a problem. I did have to learn it. It was the first feedback. I wouldn't say I've learned it yet. I would say I'm trying. And Craig also is not just, here's your problem and then walk away. No, he's offered solutions. One, by helping working with us is Tom, who I think you're familiar with. He's working with us and he's helped with some of the capacities and he's doing some things with us. And then also Craig himself will pitch in on things that aren't necessarily his expertise or what you could call his job title or his responsibilities. So, you're like, well, it's not interfacing with a military customer. That's not Craig's job. Craig will review submissions that we're doing, technical submissions. Maybe he can't change the physics laws, but he can make statements more clear. He can help, and he's willing to do it. It's really amazing. Do a PowerPoint, there's a typo, right? It happens. It happens a lot. Let's be real, too much. And Craig helps us with our attention to detail, another focus. Craig won't just be like, hey, there's a typo on slide 7. He'll be like, there's a typo on slide 7 and I fixed it. And that's been some of the help. On the concept of delegation, I certainly understand it. And you kind of mentioned it's a little tough right now on the small team. It helps, and I've alluded to it. I learned that when I worked for a good boss, right? We've all had good bosses and bad bosses. I had a guy who was the operations chief, Gunnery Sergeant Rivera. I was the dive chief. Gunnery Rivera told me, and he was trying to provide the same mentorship. He's like, you can't do everything. You have to trust your guys. You have to. I can't do it all. And so he would trust me. And so as long as that dive locker is running, he said, Keane, as long as I'm always able to dive anytime I want, the equipment has to be up, it has to be ready to go, we have to pass all of our inspections. You do whatever you want, but make sure that is always the case. And so he was very hands-off. He let me do my job. If I ever needed support, I got it. But he trusted me. And that's what, it made my life amazing. It made me happy. And I was like, God, I can't. And Craig kind of had alluded to something similar. Guess what it made me feel like? I can't let this guy down. Because he is trusting me. I start to feel a certain obligation to uphold that trust. And all of a sudden, guess what? I just got motivated to do more than I normally would have. Now that's leadership. I'll let you turn it over to Craig.
So is he right? Is that what he's doing?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what happened. The first thing I said to them was, Rob is too busy. There's only 24 hours in the day, and he's trying to put 36 hours of work into 24 hours. He needs help. And that's when I reached out to Tom Hall, who you know from your Army experience, Ranger Battalion. And I knew he's a great guy. And I've known him for about a year now through a LinkedIn connection. We got a little bit of mentorship relationship going. And I said, hey, Tom, how would you like to be part of a new adventure? Doesn't pay anything right now, but it's something I think you would enjoy. And he said,
the most fun ones don't.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how Tom Hall came onto the thing. I also said to the group, you have 3 members of the board of advisors. They're all technical people. You don't have anybody in the military on your board of advisors. And yes, I'm bringing some of that senior level experience from the military into the team, but we could use more. And so we got a retired 3-star general from the Marine Corps on our board of advisors. We have a retired one-star pilot you mentioned earlier.
This is the guy who does
Whelden's
look up
He's
so we actually have
pilot.
that on the team. Whelden, another credit to Whelden. You mentioned that. Why don't you have a general on the team who spent a lot of time looking up the tailpipe? Great point.
Yeah, we do.
Something Craig realized. He brought it on the team. He brought it on
I
the
don't
team.
have that skill set, so I found somebody who did. And Jonathan George is a great guy. He's flew the U-2 spy plane. He flew the B-1 bomber, the B-2 bomber. He was on President Obama's National Security Council. He's a member of our board of advisors. And he's brought a perspective, particularly with the Air Force, that none of the rest of us had. So as we started knocking on those doors, both those guys add credibility to our initial storyline that we give to potential customers. And so,
Well, I would argue, though, also, Craig, you do have experience with the Army's jet engine, which is the tank engine. But I know that you primarily use that as a grill out in the field.
That's
it makes
right.
nice steaks out there.
So let me tell a quick story about tankers, particularly
So
in
many
cold weather.
stories about tankers.
So you always carry a 1-gallon bucket on a tank, and the purpose of 1-gallon bucket is to stick it underneath the engine compartment so that if you have an oil leak, you're not, contaminating the ground. Well, that 1-gallon bucket also can hold water. So you take water, you carry 2 5-gallon cans of water, you fill up the 1-gallon can with water, you put it on the end of your gun tube, you swing your gun tube around to the back, you turn your tank on, you heat the thing, you drop your MREs into that hot water, it heats your meal. I mean, you can shave now because you've got hot water. There's a reason, even though I went to Ranger School in 1973, there's a reason I was a tanker and not an infantry guy.
I'm dying over here.
By the way, the smoke grenades on either side of an M1 tank are perfect for holding 6-packs of drinks. You can load those in there, too.
I was a mechanized infantry platoon leader in 4th ID.
Then you understand.
We were like halfway in between, but we would watch this type of fieldcraft antics out in the field, and it was hilarious watching this. They had the best ideas, and then we would always look at each other and go, why didn't we think about that?
Well, it's on the top of my mind. Let me tell you a quick story about inspired leadership. I once worked for a 3-star general who was a consummate gentleman. He never raised his voice in anger. He never got upset. He was an ISTJ, that's a Myers-Briggs characterization of personality, very organized, sharpened his pencils every day, made a list for the things he's going to do the next day. A colonel who was his operations officer came up to me one day. I was his deputy. And the colonel came up to me one day and he said, General so-and-so is the toughest guy I have ever worked for. And I thought at the time, wow, why is that? Because General so-and-so is a perfect gentleman. He said, because I never wanted to disappoint him. I would have been crushed if I'd ever disappointed him. And that's an indicator of inspired leadership. That colonel, like myself, and so many others in that organization, every day that we got up, we wanted to do the best we possibly could for the organization because the last thing we wanted to do was disappoint the boss. And that's kind of how I feel about Velontra. I don't want to disappoint Rob. I don't have to do this. In 3 weeks, I'll be 70 years old. I've got a couple of pensions. I'm doing fine. But this is an adventure that helps get me up every day, Velontra, and watching these young guys work the way they work to achieve their vision and their dream. And it's exciting for me.
We had a conversation about that in another previous episode with Andy Towers. He's the head coach of the Premier Lacrosse League team, the Chaos, and told a story about these two types of leadership. One being where I had a high school football coach who he would beat you. I mean, would grab you by the face mask, spit in your face, kick you when you were in your stance. And you played for this guy because it was sheer fear. I had a lacrosse coach, in the spring season who was an older guy, never got upset. But when you did something wrong, he was disappointed. And he showed you that. And it was more emotional to play for him in the spring and be wrong than it was in the fall and get beaten year in and year out.
Yeah, in front of Infantry Hall, Fort Benning, there's a statue of a leader. And in the inscription at the front says, "Follow me." And he's waving his arm forward like the troops are behind him. He's leading by example. He's out front. He's not behind the troops pointing them with a bayonet. And there's kind of a metaphor for the right way to lead is to demonstrate to your subordinates that you're part of them, you're part of the team, that you're contributing, you're leading through example. I mean, these are all basic principles of leadership, but they're so important because of the psychological impact you have on the people that you lead. It's just
you lead from the front, always.
Yeah. It's hard to measure, but it's there.
A follow me jump is the most fun type of jump master jump to do as well. That's when I think of the follow me, I know it's a little bit different. That's the first thing I think is doing a follow me and then you go. It's the best.
Yeah.
Best way to do the jump master instead of being last man, be first man. I really like it. Anyways.
So risk is a big component of building any organization. It's a big component of leading any organization. And as leaders, we have to quantify risk and we have to understand risk. Craig says in his book that life experience helps shape your definition of risk. So I'm wondering, as you build this business and you look at it from these two different perspectives, what are the biggest risks to the business and the challenges that you come out every day and face?
Is that for Rob or for me?
Either one. You're both trying to figure out how to answer this one.
Yeah.
I always have an answer. If you haven't learned that, I always have something to say.
Go ahead,
if I'm hesitating, that's actually me being polite. I always have something to say. I got a big mouth. I'll kick it off and then let Craig tie in. So this one is, we all have a lot to learn. And I haven't started a business before. So this is one that I'm learning. If you Google why do startups fail and you look at like venture capital forums, they'll even have advice and what they look for and what the biggest concern. The number one reason startups fail, it's not that the business idea is crap. There are startups that fail due to that. It's not that, they don't get enough money or they don't get customers, they don't get revenue, or they can't execute. It's the team is the number one reason startups fail, the most common reason. And that is the number one risk. And you kind of already pointed out how you solve that risk. Well, you do all the things you talk about. You focus on character. You focus on ethos. You're making sure somebody can work with the team. That's the right guy for the team. That's why, we've been talking for some amount of time on this podcast on that. It's so critical. The team, those early hires, the early leadership team members, the Craigs, they are so critical. It's the team. So I would say that's the largest risk to the business. And then there's there's a technical risk. I have to mention that, like what's the most difficult technical problem? The SR-71 flies using an afterburner essentially up to about Mach 2.25. At that point, it begins transition from a traditional turbojet with an afterburner to what's called a ramjet. But it didn't quite finish the transition. It gets up to about Mach 3.2, and that's actually why it was limited. It didn't completely shut off the turbojet. The jet engine was still doing a little bit. The ramjet was doing most of it, but the jet engine was still doing some. It didn't complete that transition. That will be the most technically difficult problem. Completing that transition is what enables us to get to that Mach 5, Mach 5.5. So number one, business standpoint, team. That's our number one business risk, in my opinion. And then the number one technical risk is completing the transition. That's the problem that hasn't quite been solved before. That has not been done.
How many people are working on this problem set? Not necessarily in team, but from a competitive edge.
Great question. Hard to say. You're asking me a tough question. But in our specific air-breathing technology, not a lot. There's a couple other companies working on this. There's a lot of people working on rockets. You can probably hire, if you wanted to hire a rocket guy, you could probably hire 10 rocket guys for every one person who has afterburner or ram burner experience. And there's a reason for that. Where do you see afterburners? Which, just so you know, the exact same physical hardware becomes a ram burner. It's the same stuff, technical stuff there. But where do you see afterburners? You see them on military fighter planes. And we build a new military fighter plane how often? We kind of talked about this. Once every 20, 30 years. Literally, we're on since the 1950s, we're on right now, in theory, we're developing the 6th generation fighter. So in 70 to 80 years, we've done 6 generations worth of fighters. So you're looking at 15 to 20 years when a new one and a new afterburner is built. That's very few total people. There are a jillion rockets and rocket companies. There's just less who work this specific approach to hypersonics. So it's small. As far as other small businesses go, I'm aware of one other person, one other entity doing it. Even in the big corporate world, a lot of them are, again, doing rocket-based approaches. There's probably one or two of the large primes that are doing something like what we're doing. I think Rolls-Royce is.
So Craig speaks about light at the end of the tunnel and the critical role that leaders play when it comes to guiding others through the dark tunnels of life. Have you experienced any dark tunnels yet?
When we started this business, I was the chief operating officer. I was not the chief executive officer. Somebody else was the chief executive officer. And this guy is a guy who's been very successful and done a lot of amazing things. But ultimately, one of the things that had to happen is we felt in a purely technical role, like we talked about, there is a certain amount you just need to speak to tech. When people talk to a startup, and we talk to venture capital, and we talk to even military people, there is going to be a point where they want to talk to the CEO. And that is going to be the person. That is just how it goes. I wasn't originally so big on titles. I didn't think it mattered, but I've learned it kind of does. And the gentleman who was helping us was not a technical guy. That's no fault of his, and it doesn't mean he wasn't value added and great for the team. Craig is not an engineer, and he's out great for the team. But we realized we needed to have somebody who just understood the raw engineering, could answer those specific engineering and tech questions. That is a difficult conversation to have. To tell somebody who very early on helped you start your business, you can't be the CEO anymore. I'm sorry, it's not working out. Oh, and by the way, I have to be. Like, that is hard to approach from both telling somebody you can't be the CEO and telling somebody, by the way, I'm going to be the CEO. That was a tough thing to deal with. We did. I would say, in my opinion, in hindsight, I'm very glad we did. I believe it has helped the overall team dynamic and order a better place due to it. But that was a dark place. That was very tough. Craig helped with week. I don't know how many hours I talked to Craig about how do we approach this? How do we deal with it? How does this happen? But that was an example of something that was, I think, tough to deal with. You don't want a person to feel like they're not valued, like they don't need to be on the team, but you have to change seats. Sometimes you have to change roles and responsibilities. That can be tough.
Well, and those are the tough conversations that you have to have as a leader, and you can't shy from those. And it's in a startup, it talked a bit about kind of what I've called the founder's dilemma. You know, the point at which a founder wakes up and says, I may have been the person who got us here, but I may not be the person who gets us there. And then having the humility to say, I got to step away. Somebody else has to take this. And that's tough on both sides of that equation. But Craig, you know, Rob said you mentored him through it. What did you see, and how do you coach someone through that?
Well, I think we all recognized the problem and the challenge early on. So the rest of us, not this one individual, but the rest of us had a number of conversations together. And it ended up being sort of like a family intervention that you might do with somebody. Not that there's a parallel to somebody who's on drugs or anything, but you know how a family intervention, you bring the entire team together and you sit down, and when you talk to somebody about change that you know will be difficult for that person, you have to think through, how is this going to be received by the other party? How is this hammer going to fall the most gentle way? And when you communicate with people, I always tell people, in fact, I do a presentation on effective communications where I tell people, look, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other person before you open your mouth. How is your message going to be received? So if you're talking to a 6-year-old or you're talking to a 60-year-old, you're talking to a liberal or a conservative, you're talking to a male or a female, you're talking to an American or a foreigner, it doesn't matter really who you're talking to. If you have a message to give, you need to understand how is that message going to be received, because it's not so much what you say that matters, it's what the other person hears. So I intuitively, over many, many years, have kind of learned when I communicate to either groups or to individuals to put myself in the shoes of that person. How is this message I'm about to receive or to issue, to give, going to be received by the other party in the best way? And then communicate it in that way. So we talked about this, call it an intervention, where we all sat down together to talk about this issue. We kind of framed it out ahead of time. You know, and one of the things you do when you've got bad news is you seed that bad news with some good news. Let me tell you all the wonderful things and the great achievements that we've had to date. However, there's a need for change for these reasons, and that's why we're doing it. It's not a reflection necessarily on the skill sets of an individual. It's a business decision.
Yeah, you got to approach it with truth, honesty, and objectivity, transparency. So, Craig, you talk about life as a journey, not necessarily a destination. As you go on this ride to build this company, this fast ride, as we talked about, are you taking time to appreciate it, Rob?
That's a good point. Enjoy the ride. You certainly do. A couple things you might bring up here at the end. That's actually kind of the idea there. One of those. So I absolutely love it. I love it. I mean, it just fits well. I feel like I was ultimately built for it. I don't know if that sounds arrogant. I'm not trying to come across arrogant, but you want to feel like, what is your life built? I'm working in something I'm passionate about. We're largely, like I said, defense and military focused. Clearly, that's a portion of my life. So I feel like those skill sets come in. I've always enjoyed leading. The best job in the Marine Corps is a Force Recon team leader. I mean, there is nothing like it. You're in charge of 6 people. We typically do 6-man teams, and you can be out in the middle of, you can be the only 6 people in some African nation somewhere. You're the senior guy. That level of autonomy, that awesome responsibility, it's so exciting. And so it applies very well when here you are, a small startup, a member of the leadership team. Not quite the same dictatorial way that is the military structure, but still having a lot of drive to control the system. Because you work at large corporate America and you quickly realize nobody gives a crap who you are or what you do. You can work in your time. Albert Einstein could work at one of the big, huge corporate companies for 30 years, and in the end, he'd get a cute little certificate, and they'd say, thanks for a great job, go away. And that's how it would be. On the small business, man, you get to impact it. And then on the other side, I'm a nerd. My dad flew the F-4 Phantom and the F-18. My brother's an Apache pilot. My uncle's an aerospace engineer on faculty, actually. I took a class from him. That was kind of cool. So I love aerospace engineering. I love science. I love space. I always have. I'm getting to put that in. I absolutely love it. It is so fun. It's a little stressful trying to get this thing off the ground, literally, pun intended, but I love it.
So I put together a little section here called Craig's Leadership Quirks. They come from him. And what I thought I would do here is throw them out. And then, Craig, you give us the kind of, top line, 2-sentence definition of what it means. All right, so the first one, timeliness is an indicator of discipline and organization.
Yeah, so let me answer that this way. First, let me tell a story. I worked for a different 3-star general than the one I told about earlier. And he just came into the organization, and the first week he had a staff meeting. And he came into the room, he sat at the end of the table, and there was a clock on the wall on the other opposite him. And he just sat there. He was there about 5 minutes early, and he looked at the clock. And when the meeting was supposed to start at 9 o'clock, and when the second hand hit the 9 o'clock, he turned to his aide and he said, close the door and lock it. So the aide closed the door and he locked it. And there were 2 people missing, 2 colonels that were on the staff that were not in the room because they were late. And of course, they came to the door about a minute or 2 later, or what, I don't remember the thing, and they found it locked. And so they knocked on the door to come in. And the general turned to his aide and said, don't open the door. So this guy had a thing about timeliness. Now, what's wrong with that? Nothing's wrong with that. I think there is something to be said about timeliness. Come into a meeting. If you're going to start at 9 o'clock, start at 9 o'clock. All of us have served, and many of your listeners perhaps who have served in the military know that when you get a line of departure time, you cross the line of departure on time. You don't cross late. You just don't. You got to cross the line of departure when you're supposed to, because there's so many other pieces of the puzzle that are dependent on you crossing the line of departure on things. So what's the point of telling that story? A couple of things. One is timeliness is important. But the other thing I think that's important is this guy, this 3-star general, had not communicated yet to his staff any of the personal quirks that he had. And if I were doing that, if I could rewind the clock and I were in his shoes, I think what I would have done is allowed the people to come into the room late. And then in my very first presentation to the staff, I talk about what's important to me. And if timeliness is one of those things, which I have a thing about, then I mention that. Timeliness is important. If we have a meeting that starts at 9 o'clock, I expect you to do that. But for weeks after that, and perhaps months, those 2 colonels who were late for that meeting carried that burden that in their very first engagement with this 3-star general, they were humiliated and they felt horrible. And was that healthy for the organization? Is that the best way to teach somebody about how important you view timeliness? I'm not sure it was the best approach, but timeliness is an indicator of discipline, I think.
The second one, attention to detail.
Yeah, crossing your T's and dotting your I's is important. Let me use another story to illustrate that. Particularly when your emotions are higher than they probably should be. Somebody sends you an email and you get it. It makes you mad. It makes you upset. It makes you angry. And so you immediately start to type out, your response. And then you hit send. And then you walk away. And then you come back and you've cooled down a little bit and you say to yourself, I wonder if I should have been less hasty. So what I tell people is, look, take a breath, do a draft, walk away, come back when things are not quite as emotionally high as they are right now, and see if you really want to push send. Because once it's out, it's too late to get it back in.
I did that before we started this podcast. I got one I didn't like. I started typing it, and then I said, you know what? I'm going to wait till the end of this. I'm going to circle back on this thing, because if I send this, it might not be the message I want.
It looks completely different the second time you look at it, because your mental state is different, and so you approach it in a different way.
All right, 3, persistence and initiative.
Yeah, that's what I love about Rob, and that's what I love about Velontra, is these guys are persistent. You know, they are absolutely dedicated to getting to the objective. And it's that special forces, I mean, they were raised that way. Rob is a force recon guy. I spent 40 years in the military, grew up in an Air Force family, so even longer in the military. Mission focused, take the hill, take the objective, not at all cost, but certainly do everything you possibly can to get to the other side. Persistence is important.
Get to the bottom line quickly.
Nothing's more frustrating than having somebody come on and tell you in a very excited way, hey, boss, we got a real problem. And then they start to spend the next 10 minutes to you describing how they got to the problem before they even tell you what the problem is. So I tell people up front, tell me the bottom line up front. You know, there's been a horrible accident on a tank range, and we've got 2 people seriously injured. They're being medevaced to the hospital right now. Don't start with how it got to that point, and 20 minutes later get to the punchline. Tell me the punchline up front, and then you can back up and tell me the story how. So understanding that you have different kinds of people on your team who bring their communication styles to the table. You don't want everybody to be just like you. Diversity is good. You want people to have different views. And so when I talk about this in my leadership presentations, I use as an example Myers-Briggs, which is a personality test. And I tell people, look, there are 16 different profiles in Myers-Briggs. I happen to be an ISTJ. I stands for introvert. Rob happens to be an E, an extrovert. That's a great pairing to have an introvert and an extrovert on the same team, because each of them brings different strengths. And I recognize the weaknesses that he has and the strengths that he has, and he recognizes the weakness, and we can make up for it with each other. So one of the things I always did when I went into an organization was oftentimes we would all take Myers-Briggs test, so we could understand what kind of personalities are on the team and where we can tap into the strengths of certain types of people and minimize the weaknesses of those same people.
Well, that's how you build resiliency in the organization. Yeah. So number 5, give detailed guidance when required.
So, when required. My wife tells me that sometimes I tell people how to build a watch. My response to that is, well, yeah, if I'm getting the vibe from this person I'm talking to that they just don't get it, I'm going to keep drilling down until I do get the vibe that they do get it. So I tell people up front, I will tell you how to build a watch if you allow me. But if you indicate to me early on you got it, then I'll back off. And as Rob said, he's got this BS detector. You know, there's a certain sense that you have that people are resonating what you say to them, or they're not. And so it's kind of like a volume control. You can either turn it up or you can turn it down based on how well you think your message is being received. You can also read the body language and see how is it being perceived, not just received, but perceived, because body language tells a lot. If somebody is sitting there and you can tell they're not listening to you because they're on their edge of their seat, waiting for you to take a breath so they can interrupt you and start, you think, this guy's not even listening to me. So being a good listener, I think, is a skill set that is very, very important as well, to demonstrate to the person who's talking to you that you genuinely care about what they're saying and that you're going to allow them to get it out. Fran, I'd ask your listeners to reflect a moment. Have they ever worked for somebody who 2 or 3 months after they came into the organization, they're still trying to figure them out? What does this guy think is important or this gal think is important? Because I don't know, because they've never told us that. And so what I have always done when I go into a new organization, and that's why Whelden on Whelden, which is a briefing I used to give when I was in the military, is in my book. It's Appendix B in my book. It's a briefing that I used to give new organizations, said, let me tell you a little bit about me. Let me tell you about my personal quirks, what I think is important. If timeliness is important, I'll tell you that. But I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my strengths and my weaknesses. Because I'm an introvert, it sometimes gives the appearance that I don't care as much. That's not true. I care a lot. But because I'm an introvert, I don't show it as much. And I have to push myself to demonstrate that warmth, that caring component of a personality, because introverts aren't very good at doing that, and I recognize that. So telling people up front who you are, how you operate, what you think is important, where your ethical boundaries are, don't cross that, because, that'll be it. That's very important, I believe. And Rob has done that. We have all done that. Those of us that are on the core team of Velontra, we all understand what our strengths and our weaknesses are, because one, we've been working together for a while, and two, very early on, we had some sessions where we kind of laid those out. We all took the Myers-Briggs test, and we then analyzed the different personalities that we have.
Number 6, talk to the person who has the action.
Yeah, so when I was a senior commander, and this becomes problematic the more senior you become, the action officer for a particular action probably knows the most about it. Now, you may have, as a senior leader, multiple layers between you and them. And so I used to tell my immediate staff, look, I like to talk to action officers. I recognize, having been an action officer, they probably have the most knowledgeable, the most current knowledge about this particular issue. So don't get insulted if I walk by your office and your subordinate's office next leader and go directly to the action officer to find something out. That is not because I don't trust you. That is because I know that action officer probably has the most complete information on the action. So it's another thing I used to tell people up front from the very beginning. Don't get upset if you see me. And your action officer should just then come back and back brief you. Hey, General Whelden came down and asked about Project X, and I gave him a briefing. This is what I told him. You should just say, okay, fine.
Last one, don't hide the bad news.
Oh, yeah. Bad news doesn't get better with time. So a metaphor I often used to tell people is, I said, it's like a tree that's bending in the wind. There's a hurricane coming, and the young sapling is bending in the wind. Don't wait until the sapling breaks before telling me that the tree just fell over. If you need help in holding the tree up, to propping it up, to keep it alive, tell me when I still have enough time to help you fix it. So bad news, oftentimes people will say, well, I got to fix this. I can't let the senior leadership learn about this, know about this. Maybe I can fix it, and then it breaks. And we've all had those experiences on both ends. And you say to yourself as a senior leader, if I'd have known about this a little bit earlier, I probably could have helped you prevent X from happening, but you didn't tell me. So, if you got bad news, bring it to me right away. Plus, if I'm constantly getting bad news late, then I start wondering, what are they hiding from me? So let's, trust me enough to know that I'm here to help you fix that problem, not to chew you out for it.
So as we close out, the Jedburghs needed to do 3 things every day during their time in World War II to be successful. They had to shoot, they had to move, they had to communicate. 3 foundational core tasks. If they were effective and proficient in these core tasks, whatever challenges came their way, their focus could be diverted to those new challenges. So I ask everybody, and I'll ask both of you, what are the 3 things that you each do every day to be successful? Rob, we'll start with you.
So I'll give you the 3 and I'll give you a line or 2 on them. Never quit. Do something. Have fun. So never quit. I mean, that's, right in the core heart, right, of that's how I became a 4th Recon Marine more than anything else. It was not strength or intelligence or fitness or any of that. It was just not quitting. And eventually I got strong enough. And it's the same way in a business. And I think it's the same way in life. Don't quit on life. And I would also say that to all of our veterans, and veteran suicide is a real issue. Just don't quit. Don't quit. You'd be stunned at what can be accomplished if you just don't quit. A lot of times, in the middle of recon school or training or even the operation, it's extremely tough and you don't know that you could do it. And you go from whatever. Well, when you get to the point, it's okay if you're like, I'm not going to be honor graduate. I'm not going to be the fastest. Just don't quit. Put the left foot in front of the right foot. And a lot can happen in life. So 1, don't quit. Whatever's going on, however tough it is, don't quit. 2, do something. Almost always. So much so that just go ahead and worry about it. Any decision is better than no decision. To me, that is so often the trait, the thing. Make a decision, do something. So every day, do something. And sometimes we're tired, we're depressed. These things happen. That's real life. So just get something done. Fine. It's not going to be a super productive day. You feel like crap. You're unmotivated. You're in that dark tunnel. It's hard to drive yourself. Okay? Pick a definitive task and finish that one. And it tends to make you feel good. You're like, I can do one more task. And next thing you know, you're getting stuff done. So make every day, again, it's similar. Put the left foot in front of the right foot. Instead of being like, oh, I'm never going to finish this 15-mile rock. Well, let's not worry about the 15-mile rock, but can we get the left foot in front of the right foot one more time? Let's do that. And then if we did that, let's talk about the right foot in front of the left foot. So never quit. Do something, and you kind of already alluded to this, Fran. Have fun. You've got to enjoy it. You've got to enjoy it. And of course, things are going to be grindy. Things are going to be hard. You're going to be just sitting there grinding out at Excel or calculations. No, us engineers don't actually just enjoy doing math. Nobody likes math. Who likes math? That's hard. It's not fun. It's grindy. But you got to have fun. So how do you do it? I remember in recon school, off the coast of, it used to be off of Virginia Beach, off Little Creek. We would use the SEAL pool up there, and we would do there. And it was like 2:30 a.m. It's March, I think, was the time frame. It's freezing cold out there. I'm in the surf. I'm chafed. I'm raw. I'm sore. I'm doing, I don't know, fin number 2 or 3 for the day. I just got beat to death on a Zodiac for an hour doing an OTH. And now I'm finning into Virginia Beach doing an amphib where they're going to make me sugar cookie roll around in the sand to get more chafed and raw. And I remember thinking, this sucks, I'm so miserable. And I was just, in a spiraling pit of my own misery. And I said, you know what? It is 2:37 a.m. I am in full gear. I am swimming 2 miles into the shore in the middle of the night. I could see the lights of Virginia Beach and all these, little kids are out there partying. And I was like, right now in the world, on the planet, how many other humans are doing what I'm doing right now? Quite possibly none. I'm probably the only human on the planet at this millisecond swimming in. And I was like, you know what? As much as this sucks, that is badass. That is fun. I'm the only human doing something like that. So have fun.
Own it and get after it.
Yeah.
Sir?
So my same church, different pew, perhaps. They're not too dissimilar from what you just heard. Because I'm an ISTJ, we're sort of organized. I make a list every day for what I'm going to do next day, what I'm going to do next week, what I'm going to do next month. I kind of make a list because that guides my path on where I'm going to go. The second thing is that I work that list. I work my way down that list every day to make sure that I've done the sort of things that I said, and that keeps me on task. And the third thing is I think that I'm thankful for what I have. I reflect on that every day. I'm thankful for my family. I'm thankful for my wife. I'm thankful for my health. I'm thankful for my faith. I'm thankful for my relationship with Rob and the rest of the Velontra team. And I know that so many people in the world are troubled and challenged and having such a difficult time. Whenever I get down, I'm thankful that I have what I have because I'm very fortunate and I'm very lucky. So I remind myself that on a daily basis.
Thank you. Rob, never quit, do something, have fun. Sir, make a list of tasks, work the list, and be thankful for what we have. I appreciate you both sharing that. So we spoke about the 9 characteristics of elite performance a bit earlier. We talk about them here on the podcast in every episode, and we quantify it in the fact that in order to be an elite performer, you have to have all 9, but you never demonstrate all 9 at the same time because the situation depends on which ratio or which ones of those you use. At the end of each of these episodes, I apply 1 to my guess. That quantifies you when I think about it. And I really do, for this episode and for this conversation and for each of you, think about effective intelligence, especially for you, sir. Rob, drive comes to my mind for you, and this incredible energy. Your energy, Rob, is contagious and it's inspirational, and it makes you just want to, as you said, go do something because there's so much fire and so much drive behind it, and it's admirable. Sir, your guidance, your perspective, it's motivating and it's aspirational. As young leaders who have served alongside you, served under you, serve around you, to see the perspective that you bring to a problem and the way that you handle it makes all of us envious. And I only hope that one day when we're faced with the challenges that you have, that we can find the same resolution and provide our perspective down to young leaders one day, as you're doing each and every morning when you wake up. You're both competing in a difficult and hyper-competitive space. Innovation has to happen every day. You will not get there without drive. You will not get there without effective intelligence. I'm honored to have sat here with you today, learned from both of you. I'm excited for the future of Velontra. I can't wait to see where it goes. And I look forward to doing this conversation again in time on the back end of a tremendous amount of success. Thank you for joining me on this today.
Thank you, Fran. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much. We're honored to be here and appreciate your time spent with us.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, the Talent War Group, and the Jedburgh podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow. This episode is brought to you by Analytics. As owners of small to medium-sized businesses, we face tons of challenges in our companies. Imagine if our only role as owners was to focus on growing our business, not on all the other stuff that needs to get done. Analytics specializes in helping businesses succeed by doing just that, managing everything else. Analytics provides a deep bench of solutions to handle the most complex challenges in finance and accounting, IT, data management, AV, and healthcare. Around these services, they wrap Insight 360, a cloud-based portal that houses your company's financial and operational information. Insight 360 develops customized reports showing key metrics, benchmarks, and KPIs for better insight into your business's performance. Visit analytics.com for more information. That's ANALYTIX.com.